Thank you to my patrons. Your generosity and commitment to my work is astonishing. I sincerely appreciate it. If you'd like to see your name in the credits and gain access to a plethora of other perks, bonuses, and extras, please consider becoming a patron today. Simply click the link in the description below. Thank you. You're not going to prove it intellectually.
Yeah, I'm not going to prove this intellectually.
So how else is it going to be proven? I mean, this is the level we're at, folks. So we've now abandoned intellectual pursuits. We're no longer talking about reason and rationality, but I'm going to go ahead and believe it anyway. How is this not an admission that you're irrational? That's what I want to know. Why is this guy taken seriously? Why didn't everybody on the panel just immediately start laughing?
Tide goes in, tide goes out. Never miscommunication. You can't explain that.
Evolution is a religion.
If there is just one chance in a million that this is true, it's worth believing.
Hey everybody, Magic Skeptic here, and you're all very welcome to another episode of When Theists Fail. Coming right up is everybody's favourite obscurantist and charlatan religious scholar, Reza Aslan, who's going to share with us such gems as all religions are the same, didn't you know? And he's even going to tell us the true definition of what an atheist is and why he isn't one. Spoiler alert, he says he's not an atheist because it's not sophisticated enough, as though that weren't a non sequitur. In any case, dear listener, if that sounds entertaining, if that sounds fun, let's get right into it. I hope you enjoy it.
When you study the religions of the world, it becomes impossible to take any one of these religions all that seriously.
In what is perhaps a channel first, I'm going to start this video in a strange moment of agreement. I think Reza is spot on here. It's impossible to take any of these religions seriously. So, I don't know if that's a good omen or a bad omen, dear listener, but yeah, Reza and I are in violent agreement at this juncture. Let's see where he goes with this.
And there's two reasons for it. One, because you instantly recognize the religious patterns, the sort of phenomena that they all have in common with each other, that they're all saying basically the same thing. And more importantly, they're saying it kind of in the same way, right? A lot of the same myths are just kind of repurposed. The myth of Jesus's resurrection is just the myth of Mithra's resurrection, right? The Strauchant in Zoroastrianism is a salvific character whose mother magically gets impregnated and gives birth to a messianic figure who brings in the end of the world. That's 1,000 years before Jesus, right? I mean, these are just the same stories over and over and over again. However, they are interlinked in the sense that they are trying to express something that, as a person of faith, I believe is real.
And not surprisingly, the strange note of agreement was short-lived. Be honest with yourself, dear listener. You didn't think it was going to last very long either, did you? Did you really? This is one of the most irritating things that Reza Aslan drones on about. He makes this claim anytime he gets a chance to sit in front of a microphone. He words it slightly differently depending on the appearance, but the overall point is the same. The religions of the world are basically identical. They're the same as one another. It's the same myths repurposed over and over and over again. And they're not just the same myths, but the myths are being expressed in roughly the same way and so forth.
They're all saying basically the same thing. And more importantly, they're saying it kind of in the same way.
I think that this is spectacularly stupid. This is fundamentally wrong. And I think there's a reason why Reza parrots this talking point. So he wants the viewer to believe that Islam is not very much different from Christianity, and Christianity is not so different from Hinduism, and Hinduism is not so different from Buddhism, and so on and so forth. All of the world's religions are the same, and they're all mostly good with a positive message, and you don't need to think about it any more than that, dear listener. But of course, we know that this is completely and utterly false. Specific beliefs have specific consequences. Sure, there are overarching themes. I wouldn't deny that there are archetypical stories that have been repurposed throughout history. You'd have to be blind or an idiot, or you'd have to have been living under a rock not to notice that. I'm fully in agreement there. But to launch from that talking point to the idea that the world religions are basically saying the same thing in the same way is absolutely and utterly ludicrous.
They're all saying basically the same thing. And more importantly, they're saying it kind of in the same way.
All you need do is hone in on one topic or another in order to see that this is just false. This is just completely wrong-headed. Take the example of embryonic stem cell research. If you look at the world religions, you can see that there are drastically different consequences on the ground depending on the theology. A cursory Google reveals that there exists a consensus amongst Islamic scholars and Islamic religious authorities on the question of stem cell research. Generally speaking, they're agreed on the question. Stem cell research is acceptable. Why? Well, it comes down to a whole host of factors. Like any belief, it's arrived at through a complex interplay of sociological forces, religion, politics, culture, etc. But one cannot ignore the role that theology is playing in this consensus. Muslims generally agree that ensoulment, the moment where the soul enters the fetus, occurs at day 120 of gestation. And with this theological tenet in mind, stem cell research, specifically embryonic stem cell research, isn't a problem, because stem cell research that's conducted on embryos occurs before day 120 of gestation. And so experimenting on embryos pre-day 120 doesn't destroy a soul. One can draw a very straightforward line between this theological belief about ensoulment and the Islamic consensus about the acceptability of stem cell research. This general Islamic acceptance of embryonic stem cell research stands in complete and utter contrast to many Christians who find the concept of embryonic stem cell research to be monstrous. Again, Christians will have this view for a variety of reasons, a complex interplay of social, societal, cultural, religious, and political factors. But once again, one cannot ignore the role that theology is playing here. Specifically, the idea that life begins at conception, that ensoulment occurs at the moment of conception. This makes experimentation with embryos tantamount to murder. So as you can see, and contrary to Reza's claims, our religions are not saying the same things in the same ways. Sure, there are some commonalities and overarching themes, but the devil is in the details. Specific beliefs have specific consequences, and on the question of embryonic stem cell research, our religions arrive at completely opposing points of view, precisely or at least in part because of their theological underpinnings. Suffice to say, our religions are different, and Reza's point is bunk. Allow me to give you one other example, just to make the point crystal clear. This example comes from one Sam Harris. Take the religion of Jainism. Why is it that we never hear of Jain suicide bombers? Why is it that we never hear of Jain honor killings? Could it be perhaps because the central tenet of Jainism is non-violence? Radical Jains are the people that we need to worry about least in the entire world. Radical Jains won't even mow their lawn for fear that they're committing a holocaust when they wipe out all of the insects and earthworms that are living there. You see, Jains are utterly neutered by their pacifism. The more radical a Jain you are, the less we have to worry about you. Could it be that Jain theology is different from, say, Islamic theology? Why is it that we hear of Islamic terrorism in the news? Why is it that there are certain Muslims who are willing to become violent in the name of their faith?
When I encountered the violence in Islam, I said, well, this can't be the true Islam. And I, for years, would push back, arguing, no, this hadith here is unreliable. For example, Muhammad says in Sahih Muslim that he has come to expel the Jews and Christians from the Arabian Peninsula and will not leave any but Muslims. That doesn't sound like the Muhammad I knew. So I said, well, that can't be a reliable tradition. And then another tradition from Sahih Bukhari, which says, I have been ordered to fight people until they testify that there is no God but Allah, and only then will their lives and their property be saved from me. And this is from the most reliable collection of hadith, Sahih Bukhari. And so I said, no, that can't be reliable either. And as you continue, you find Muhammad beheading multiple hundreds of men at the same time. You see him distributing those men's wives and children into slavery. You see him torturing people for money. You see him, all these atrocities within Muhammad's life, and not always in defensive battles by any means, offensively as well. And so, after trying to dismiss many of these traditions, I said, well, let me piece together what's going on here, because if I dismiss all of these violent traditions, then I am basically dismissing the foundations of Islam. This is where I get my picture of Muhammad from. So looking just at the sources, what is the story? How do I reconstruct what Muhammad's life is like? And what you find when you do that, because there certainly are peaceful passages in the Quran. We can't ignore that. Like chapter 2, verse 256 of the Quran, which says there's no compulsion in religion.
And those are often the ones that are quoted in
those
response
are often
to,
the ones,
to people.
Chapter 109, which says, those of you who disbelieve, believe whatever you want and let us believe what we want. Fairly peaceful. One of the ones that's I can't say this without laughing a bit, but so abused is chapter 5, verse 32 of the Quran, which says, if you kill one person, it says if you kill all of mankind. And if you save a life, it says if you save all of mankind. When you start understanding the context, though, you realize that this is not the ultimate message of Islam. For example, that one verse, chapter 5, verse 32 of the Quran, says the first part of that verse is, it was told to the Jews. If you kill one person, it's as if you kill all mankind. If you save a life, as if you save all mankind. And we do. We find that in Tractate Sanhedrin of the Babylonian Talmud.
I see.
It's not in the Quran. It's not a teaching for Muslims. The next verse is the teaching for Muslims, which says, if anyone creates mischief in the land or strives against Allah or His Messenger, crucify him or kill him.
Right, a very different message.
Exactly.
Suffice to say, Reza is fundamentally mistaken here. The world religions are not the same. They're not saying the same things, and they're certainly not saying them in the same way. Specific tenets have specific consequences, and that's why we see different behaviors on the ground in different contexts. We don't see Jain suicide bombers because Jainism can't possibly motivate somebody to be a suicide bomber. Am I saying that a member of the religion of Jainism could never be a suicide bomber? Of course not. They could become a suicide bomber, but the difference is they could never possibly use their Jainism as the excuse. They could never possibly be motivated by their Jainism. They would become a suicide bomber in spite of their religion. You cannot say the same for Islam. Islam has certain statements and certain passages in surahs that appear to encourage violence, that appear to encourage martyrdom. But Reza wants us to believe that all of the world religions are the same. They're all about love and kindness and compassion. He wants you to shut off your critical mind. He wants you to ignore these differences so that he can parrot this age-old talking point that religion is all about kumbaya, my lord. Religions are all about love and compassion and kindness. My arse.
There is something beyond the material realm. There is a real, transcendent reality beyond the physical world that we are locked in.
But it's faith.
It's faith.
Prove it, Reza. Prove it, or shut up. Sorry, I'm out of patience at this point, dear listener. Prove it, or be quiet. Prove it, or cease speaking, because I'm not interested in you asserting what you think must be the case. I don't agree with you. I don't think you're right. I'm not saying that you're definitely wrong. I'm not asserting that the supernatural doesn't exist, for as far as I can tell, there's no mechanism to demonstrate either way. It is unfalsifiable. But you appear to be convinced by it, Reza, and yet you simultaneously admit that it's faith. In other words, you don't have a good reason to believe it, but you're going to go ahead and believe it anyway. That, as far as I can tell, is the very definition of irrationality, believing things for which you have no good evidence or reason. Anyway, let's proceed.
Let's try to rid our minds of these categories like atheist, Muslim. Well, if you're clearly not a Christian because you question certain aspects of the Bible, bullshit. There are hundreds of millions of Christians who would agree with everything that I just said. There is no such thing as Christianity. Let's start there. There is no such thing as Islam. There is no such thing as Judaism. There is no such thing as Buddhism. There is only Christianities, Buddhisms, Islams. Christianity is whatever a Christian says it is. Buddhism is whatever a Buddhist says it is. There is no mechanism for me to say, you call yourself a Buddhist, okay, but you don't believe this part.
Interpretation of the person is what you're saying.
You're not really a Buddhist. So let's start there. That's the important thing.
Please notice the academic sensitivity, how careful and cautious he's being here to define things in such a way not to exclude anything from his area of expertise.
Christianity is whatever a Christian says it is. Buddhism is whatever a Buddhist says it is.
He's being very cautious and careful not to define Christianity or Islam or any other faith for that matter too narrowly.
There is only Christianities, Buddhisms, Islams.
Christianities is the best way to look at it. Islams is the best way to look at it. It's not a monolithic block. These religious believers disagree with one another, and so we must proceed with sensitivity and academic rigor. And that's exactly what Reza is doing here. But this sensitivity quickly falls by the wayside when Reza speaks about atheism in a couple of moments. So just put a pin in that for now, and remember this moment, because it's going to be incredibly important when it comes to judging Reza on his complete lack of sensitivity that's going to emerge shortly. Let's proceed for now.
The second thing that I think is really important to understand is that religion, all religions, are far less a matter of beliefs and practices than they are a matter of identity. And that's true of every religion in the world and every part of the world. 70% of Americans call themselves Christian. Bullshit. Bullshit. 70% of Americans follow the teachings of Christ. 70% of Americans go to church on, Sundays. 70% of Americans read the Bible on a consistent basis. The vast majority of that 70%, when they say I am Christian, they are not making a faith statement. They're making an identity statement. And that is true of Buddhists and Jews and Muslims. What we people on the outside tend to do is think that religion is just about the things that you believe. And if you don't believe what the mainstream believes, then you're not really that thing anymore.
I don't disagree with that.
I can't help but feel that he just shot himself in the foot here. Did he not just say a moment ago that there's no mechanism to conclude whether or not somebody is a quote-unquote true Christian or a quote-unquote true Muslim or what have you?
There is no mechanism for me to say, you call yourself a Buddhist, okay, but you don't believe this part.
Interpretation
so therefore
of the person is what you're saying.
You're not really a Buddhist.
And yet, here he is right now pointing out that 70% of Americans identify as Christian. And then he says, bullshit. They're not really Christians.
70% of Americans call themselves Christian. Bullshit.
I mean, correct me if I'm wrong here, dear listener. Jump into the comments below and let me know. But I can't help but feel that he has just completely contradicted himself. So on one hand, he says that Christianity is whatever a Christian says it is.
Christianity is whatever a Christian says it is. Buddhism is whatever a Buddhist says it is.
But on the other hand, he appears to be articulating skepticism about a certain segment of the Christian population and their self-identification as Christian. He appears to have erected his own independent criteria that he uses to disqualify self-identifying Christians as Christian.
Bullshit. 70% of Americans follow the teachings of Christ. 70% of Americans go to church on, Sundays. 70% of Americans read the Bible on a consistent basis.
You cannot hold both of these views simultaneously. They are in complete contradiction to one another. Either Christians tell us what Christianity is, or they don't. You cannot say that both Christians suggest what Christianity is and then also erect an independent set of criteria to disqualify those very same self-identifying Christians. That is a complete muddled contradiction. This is just nonsense. I don't know how he's managed to make this mistake. To be honest, this mistake is so significant that I'm starting to believe that I must have misunderstood him. So if that's what's happened, dear listener, jump into the comments below and let me know what that misunderstanding is. With that said, let's proceed to the next point.
I am not an atheist because I think atheism is an intellectually vacuous position. I think it's unsophisticated. I don't think it's smart.
Don't you just love when the first words that came out of Reza's mouth pertaining to atheism were arguably a non sequitur? Who cares if atheism is sophisticated or not? I would go so far as to say that atheism is definitionally not sophisticated. It is a single belief on a single issue. Does God exist? Atheists say we're not convinced. There's nothing much sophisticated about that. It's a singular tenet. I mean, sophistication has nothing to do with it. But who cares about sophistication? Something can be sophisticated and be true or false, or it could not be sophisticated and be true or false. In other words, sophistication is not truth tracking. Sophistication has nothing to do with whether or not something is true. It is a complete non sequitur to suggest that I'm not an atheist because it's not a sophisticated position. Is he a fucking moron or what? If you're going to go ahead and criticize atheism, Reza, well then I would recommend that the first words out of your mouth not be a non sequitur. This is just colossally dumb. This is spectacularly stupid. Ugh, give me a break. Let's continue. Roll the tape.
An atheist, a true atheist, right? Someone who is truly an atheist is a materialist. A materialist believes that literally nothing exists, that nothing can exist beyond my empirical experience of that thing.
Who are you, Reza, to suggest what a true atheist is or isn't? Isn't atheism best understood as atheisms?
There is only Christianities, Buddhisms, Islams.
Aren't there different atheists who self-identify in different ways?
Christianity is whatever a Christian says it is. Buddhism is whatever a Buddhist says it is.
And by the way, dear listener, that is undoubtedly the case. There are, in fact, different definitions for atheist. I myself use the definition of I'm simply unconvinced in the existence of theistic claims about the existence of the divine or a god or gods or what have you. But there are other atheists who say that you're not an atheist unless you hold to the so-called hard atheist position and you claim that there are no gods. But Reza doesn't appear to know or care about any of these details. When it comes to atheism, Reza has his mind made up. He's not interested in how atheists self-identify. He's not interested in what we have to say. He has a definition in mind, and that's the definition he's sticking with. He doesn't demonstrate any of the charitable instinct that's on display when he talks about theistic worldviews. You don't hear Reza talking about atheisms and referring to the fact that atheism is whatever atheists say it is. No. Reza has his mind made up. Even the most ardent Reza Aslan fan would have to admit, at best, this treatment of atheists is unfair. But at worst, I'm going to go ahead and suggest that this treatment of atheists disqualifies Reza Aslan from being taken seriously as an academic. Imagine we were talking about an historian right now, dear listener, and imagine this historian treated one particular group in history unfairly. Imagine when this historian is talking about other groups, they're more charitable, they're more lenient, they're more willing to take on board the views that are presented in the literature regarding those other groups. But when it comes to their selected group, the group that they don't like, they always and inevitably lose their charitable instinct.
I am not an atheist because I think atheism is an intellectually vacuous position.
They always and inevitably manage to find the negative. They define them in a way that the group wouldn't even agree with.
A true atheist, right? Someone who is truly an atheist is a materialist.
This kind of historian shouldn't be taken seriously. This kind of historian would be viewed as academically inappropriate at the very least. Well, this is exactly the kind of game that Reza is playing with atheism. Why would he treat theistic worldviews with a different standard when compared with non-theistic worldviews? Why does he exhibit a charitable instinct when it comes to theistic views and a considerably uncharitable instinct when it comes to atheistic or non-theistic worldviews? This is completely unfair. And furthermore, this definition doesn't even make sense. If you shackle atheism to materialism, and sure, many atheists might in fact be materialists.
A true atheist, right? Someone who is truly an atheist is a materialist.
But if you're going to insist that atheism is shackled to materialism, what label are you going to use for atheists who don't believe in a God and yet still do have some belief in the immaterial? An atheist, for example, who believes in ghosts or believes in the Platonic world of forms. What word are we going to use for those atheists? Because according to Reza, an atheist is someone who doesn't believe in a God and who's also a materialist. So the kind of atheist I just described doesn't fit that label. In other words, atheists who believe in some other kind of immaterial entity don't fit Reza's description of what an atheist is. So here we have Reza now having to come up with a brand new word for people who don't believe in gods but believe in some other supernatural woo. Clearly, this is absurd, and it shines light on the ridiculous nature of Reza's definition for atheism. Suffice to say, why anybody takes this guy seriously is bewildering to me. And with all that said, let's proceed.
Now, what is that other thing? Who knows? Okay, let's just give it a word, because that's all the word God is. It's just a word. It's not a thing. It's a word. And like all words, it has 1,000 connotations. It represents a bunch of things. But in its simplest form, let's just say what we mean when we say God is that which is beyond the material realm, the thing. The question then becomes, can I access that thing? Do I have the ability to commune with it, to communicate with it, to experience it in some way? And that's a personal thing. I've accessed it. I've communicated with it. I've experienced it. People who do yoga, people who climb mountains, people who surf, and yes, people who are Christians or Jews or Muslims or Buddhists or whatever can tell you a very similar story. Yeah, I'm not going to prove this intellectually. All I can tell you is that there is something beyond, and I have touched it.
You're not going to prove it intellectually.
Yeah, I'm not going to prove this intellectually.
So how else is it going to be proven? I mean, this is the level we're at, folks. So we've now abandoned intellectual pursuits. We're no longer talking about reason and rationality, but I'm going to go ahead and believe it anyway. How is this not an admission that you're irrational? That's what I want to know. Why is this guy taken seriously? Why didn't everybody on the panel just immediately start laughing?
Voy a la playa, ya subió la marea.
So you're not going to be able to prove it intellectually. Well, how else does one prove something, Reza? You claim to have touched this unfalsifiable divine reality, this unfalsifiable other. You claim to have experienced it. Well, how do you know that? How do you really know that? How do we distinguish between a real, quote unquote, real religious experience and a fake one? Isn't it possible that somebody could have a fake experience that they interpret as real? Isn't it possible that somebody could have a hallucination, for example, that's completely explicable through natural means, and yet they interpret that hallucination through a religious lens? Wouldn't that interpretation be false? Wouldn't they be mistaken? Let's just say, for example, that their hallucination was caused by TLE, temporal lobe epilepsy, a condition which is known to result in so-called religious hallucinations. These hallucinations are explicable through purely natural means, and yet those who experience them often recount them in religious ways. They report feelings of being connected to the universe, feeling at one with the universe. They report feelings of being connected to the divine or being connected to God and so forth. And yet you and I know, dear listener, that this experience is being caused by a malady of the brain, so-called TLE, temporal lobe epilepsy. So it's possible to have an experience that the experiencer describes as religious And yet it isn't. It has a purely natural explanation. So we return again to Reza. How does Reza know that he has actually had an experience with the divine, with God, as he puts it? How does he know? How does he know that he's not suffering from some kind of an hallucination? How does he know that he doesn't have TLE? Has he had a brain scan? Has he looked into this? How does he know that he wasn't just engaging in what Freud might have called wish fulfillment? If you want something to happen bad enough, it's possible to alter your state of consciousness. This is what meditation is all about. None of this requires the existence of some kind of a divine reality. All of this is explicable through purely natural mechanisms, psychology, the brain chemistry, not to mention drugs and the ability that they have to offer transcendent states of consciousness. And when I say transcendent there, dear listener, I don't mean that you're accessing some kind of another reality. I'm just using that word as a label for a state of consciousness which is different from your standard consciousness, from your day-to-day experience. Suffice to say, there's a plethora of ways that a person could have a religious experience, and it doesn't require the existence of the divine or an invisible reality. So once again, I would ask Reza, how does he know? I had this debate with somebody in the comments once before, and he said to me that these experiences are self-authenticating. You know because you know because you know. Well, isn't that convenient? Now we know why intellectualism gets thrown out the window.
Yeah, I'm not going to prove this intellectually.
Because that isn't a very intellectual or smart thing to say, is it? You know because you know because you know? Well, the person who had a fake experience reports that exact same feeling. The person who had the experience, which is false, and yet they believe it to be true, will tell me the exact same thing. That they know because they know because they know. The experience is self-authenticating. So if I have an allegedly real experience on my right, a person who's really experienced it, and they know because they know because they know, and I have a person on my left who thinks that they've experienced it, but it's false, but they tell me the same thing. They know because they know because they know. How am I to distinguish between the pair? And how would they themselves know that they have the real self-authenticating experience when both of them are self-reporting this feeling of self-authentication? You see, not only is there no mechanism for me as a third-party observer of these two people, not only is there no mechanism for me to distinguish between an allegedly real experience and a false experience, a fake experience, but they don't even have a mechanism whereby they can distinguish between a real and a false experience inside their own mind. This is unfalsifiable. So when Reza says that he has touched a divine reality, that he has experienced God, he is once again writing checks that his ass cannot cash. It is not convincing. It shouldn't even convince him. If I had a religious experience in the morning that felt self-authenticating, because I am a skeptic, I would doubt it. My first thought wouldn't be, oh my God, I've had a self-authenticating experience of the divine. No, my first thought would be, what's going wrong? Is there an experience in my brain that's happening here? Do I have TLE? Did I accidentally consume some drugs? Am I engaged in wish fulfillment? Or is there something else going on? And if I couldn't explain it at all, that wouldn't be the time to believe that God was actually involved. Maybe the real truth at the end of this experience would be to admit that I don't know how or why it happened. If something is subjectively mysterious to you, if you don't know why something happened in your brain, if you experienced a state of consciousness that has fundamentally confused you and you don't know from whence it came or why it occurred, well then the truth is you don't know, and you don't get to leap from I don't know to therefore God, lest you be accused of an argument from ignorance fallacy. So you see, guys, there's multiple layers of ridiculousness at play here. I see no reason to take anything that Reza is saying seriously, not to suggest that he's being a liar. I take him at his word that he's actually experienced a state of consciousness that he's describing as godlike or divine. I totally take him at his word. I'm not calling him a liar, but I see no reason to believe that it really was divine. There's not even a good reason for him to believe that it was divine. But as you've already heard, and has he already admitted himself, his position is a faith-based one.
It's faith.
It's faith.
And he's chucked intellectualism out the window.
Yeah, I'm not going to prove this intellectually.
So it shouldn't surprise anybody that he's going to utter these kinds of ridiculous things. And with that said, let's proceed.
The Buddha very famously said, if you want to strike water, you don't dig 6 1-foot wells. You dig 1 6-foot well. Islam is my 6-foot well. But the important thing that's hidden in the Buddha's words there is that the well is irrelevant. The well is nothing more than the means to get to the water. And guess what? The water that you're drinking from is the water that every well is drinking from. So pick a well. Pick a well that works for you.
Don't you just love this analogy? It's so self-serving. Yes, if you dig a 6-foot well, you might find some water. And if we view religion through this analogy, it seems so reasonable. But the truth is, the real analogy goes something like this. You're digging a 6-foot well to find some magic invisible water that nobody has ever seen, tasted, touched, weighed, or quantified in any way. This water is spaceless, timeless, immaterial, intangible, hitherto unseen. There is no evidence for this water at all, and yet you're going to continue digging the well in search of it anyway. That's the true analogy. And please notice that he re-articulates his earlier point about how all religions are the same. Oh, we're all drinking from the same water.
The water that you're drinking from is the water that every well is drinking from.
But as I've already pointed out, no. The water, metaphorically speaking, of each religion is not the same. Specific beliefs have specific consequences. Not every religion is sharing the same water. That's not what's happening, and no honest person with their eyes open could conclude otherwise. The world religions are different. The water is very different. Some religions are digging a well to find water, whereas other religions are digging a well to find lava, whereas other religions are digging a well to find something else. Pond scum, sewage, or what have you. The world religions are not all tapping in to the same ideas and the same beliefs. And again, all one need do is look at the nightly news to see the consequences of different beliefs and theological tenets in action. But with that said, let's proceed.
In my case, for a whole host of reasons, my culture, my background, my identity, my comfort, Islam is my 6-foot well. And particularly Sufi Islam is my 6-foot well. It's the language that I use to make sense of a thing that is inexpressible. It's a language I use to talk about a thing that's impossible to talk about. And it's a language that other people understand, so I can communicate with them. They get it. We can talk about that experience. But to say that I believe in the well is stupid. People who say, I believe in Christianity, I believe in Islam, I believe in the Quran, I believe in the Torah, are doing it wrong. Those are not things to believe in. They're your well.
So in closing, Reza says that these beliefs are inexpressible, that it's impossible to describe them.
It's the language that I use to make sense of a thing that is inexpressible. It's a language I use to talk about a thing that's impossible to talk about.
Can you imagine how Reza would react if I were to speak in a similar fashion vis-a-vis atheism or materialism? Imagine Reza and I were in a debate and he asked me to explain why I'm a materialist. And I said to him, well, you know what? Atheism and materialism, they're just my well.
Islam is my 6-foot well.
They're just mechanisms that I use to try and express the inexpressible.
It's the language that I use to make sense of a thing that is inexpressible.
I just have faith.
It's faith.
It's faith.
I can't really explain this, but I know that it's true because the material world has touched me. I've felt it.
All I can tell you is that there is something beyond, and I have touched it.
I can't express it. It's inexpressible.
It's a language I use to talk about a thing that's impossible to talk about.
Atheism is just about words. Atheism is just about language. So too is materialism.
And it's a language that other people understand, so I can communicate with them. They get it. We can talk about that experience.
Can you imagine how quickly I would be laughed off of the stage? Can you imagine how quickly Reza would chop me off at the knee, cut me off at the knee, and make an absolute fool out of me? And justifiably so. If I were to speak in that manner, I shouldn't be taken seriously. My point of view should be ignored. I should be laughed out of any room that I open my mouth in. And yet, this style of parlance, this way of communicating, appears to be par for the course when it comes to religious adherents, especially people like Mr. Reza Aslan here. I'm expressing the inexpressible. It's impossible to explain, but I'm going to try and explain it. This style of conversation is nonsensical. No wonder he admitted to abandoning intellectual pursuits earlier in the conversation.
Yeah, I'm not going to prove this intellectually.
This is utterly laughable, and it shouldn't be taken seriously by any thinking person.